This is yet another edition of this, call it experiment, call it newfangled um, aspect for me. Um, Brand new. I went live technically yesterday, so that was the first time I did live. That was sort of a pilot episode, if you will, that was entitled The Shakespeare Myth and dealt with uh, my stance essentially on what is known as the Shakespeare authorship question. So, if anyone saw it, I don't know if anyone did see it. Um, I actually hope people wouldn't see it, but apparently some did. So, this, of course, is another installment in the experiment that is the live show. And we're going to look at, as always, the live show looks at film, television, and literature. So, yesterday we looked at literature, William Shakespeare in particular. Today we're going to look at the world of television. What an awfully cliched term. We're going to look at a particular TV show that's unlike those of other television shows, not only in the US, but in the UK, which is where it's from. The show by the name of The Prisoner, produced by Lou Grade, known as Lord Grade, um, and starring Patrick McGowan as the character known as Number Six. Now, if you're a fan of The Prisoner, you won't need me to go into too much detail about the basic aspects of the show. For those of you who have not heard of The Prisoner, um, and I'm sad that you haven't, but those of you who haven't heard about The Prisoner is, to give a précis about the show. The Prisoner is basically a show about, as I mentioned, the heretofore named Number Six, an individual in the opening credits of The Prisoner is driving into a garage, heads to an office. This is all done as music is uh, over the scenes of the opening titles, right? And the individual comes into the office, mean scowl on his face. He's obviously pissed off. He's obviously angry. Takes a letter out, puts it on the desk, hits the desk, storms out, and gets in the car. Car leaves. He heads back to what appears to be an apartment. Gets out a suitcase, and you see this picture, which he touches, of looks like a tropical island somewhere, and he is being followed as he was coming to this apartment. He's being followed, and there's a black car out there. It's like almost like a hearse, I would say. And you have someone get out, you know, black top hat, black clothes, almost like a funeral attendant, right? And head to the door as he's already gone in. He meaning Patrick McGowan, as he's already gone in. And you see from the door this sort of plume, stream of gas or smoke, which is apparently gas because it knocks out Number Six, as he is later to be known. We'll just call him Patrick McGowan here. It knocks him out eventually. And the next thing, we cut to him waking up. And he opens window blinds. And we get our first view of this place, which will heretofore be known as, or as known in the show, is the village. And that's basically how The Prisoner opens. Now, again, for those who are not aware of the history of the television show The Prisoner is a show, of course, as I mentioned, starring Patrick McGowan. And prior to The Prisoner, Patrick McGowan had been in a show known as Secret Agent. I think in the States it may have been called Danger Man, if I'm not mistaken, where he played a spy. I think John Drake was the name. And he had done that for a number of series, as they call it in the UK, seasons, as we would call it in the US. And he did that for a number of seasons or series. And McGowan had gotten tired of doing Secret Agent. He didn't want to do the show anymore. And he went to Lou Grade, I think it became Lord Grade, if I'm not mistaken. But Lou Grade, who was running ITC, production company, um, and said he didn't want to do the series. Grade had wanted him to continue on with the series, from what I understand, but McGowan had told him about this other idea. Now, when it comes to The Prisoner, the whole I don't know if controversy is the right word for it. I think it is. The whole controversy over The Prisoner deals with whether or not um, who came, whether or not it was just McGowan who came up with the idea for The Prisoner, or whether it was someone like George Markstein who became the script editor on the series, and he eventually quit the series. Um, so there's scuttlebutt about whose initial concept it was. I think both men had claimed it. Um, Clearly, Patrick McGowan was a force behind the series. I would tend to give him, I think, the lion's share of credit when it comes to The Prisoner, because McGowan not only was the star of the series, the title name, but he also wrote some of the episodes and directed some of the episodes. And he wrote some of the episodes not under his name, but under other names. So I think in an interview he did in 1977 in Canada, I think it was in Ontario, if I'm not mistaken, McGowan had said that he wrote at least 5 episodes of The Prisoner. And basically, there were about 16 that were made. Actually, McGowan said, I think in the same interview, that he only saw the show going to about seven seven episodes. He saw it as a very limited. I think he used the term serial, not series. He didn't really see it in terms of what I would call full slate, right? In the States, it's been like 22. It would vary, and it depends about the networks. It would be like 22 at least. 20, years ago was even more, right? Um, I mean, if you look at Gilligan's Island, for example, that's kind of an odd show to use as an example. They had shot. They only were on the air for like 3 seasons, but they shot, I think, 90 over 90 episodes in about three seasons. But in any event, um, basically the deal that was made for The Prisoner, the story that it comes out, at least from McGowan, is that he told uh, Grade about Lou Grade about this idea he had, and Lou Grade didn't pretend to understand and didn't understand the idea, the concept, but he decided to go along with it, and I think I forget how far down the line it was, but basically Grade had told um, Grade had told McGowan that he wanted that he needed what, over 20 episodes, because he was trying to make a deal with, I think it was CBS at the time, to show this new show in the U.S. Right, so he was trying to make a deal for distribution in the U.S. And McGowan, as I had mentioned, had only saw the show really as about 7. When we look at The Prisoner, I would argue that I think McGowan was right. I really do believe he was right. I think The Prisoner, as much as I enjoy the show, and one of the reasons I'm talking about the show now, of course, is because I have been a fan of The Prisoner for quite a long time, probably over 20 years. And in assessing the show, I would tend to believe that, or I would tend to go along with McGowan. I think he was absolutely right. I don't think that The Prisoner is a concept that should have been, I think it wound up 17 episodes. I don't think it should have been 17 episodes. As much as I enjoy the series and as much as I enjoy the episodes, I think McGowan was essentially correct. I think it should have been 7. And that this is a concept that should not have been exaggerated or metastasized or expanded beyond that basic level. I think we have a person in the chat. My regards to, I think it's Desert Woman. Um, but in any event, we're discussing the television show The Prisoner. And I'm here to provide my analysis of The Prisoner. Um, and my look into the show. Right. Now, I'm sure on YouTube you will, if you're a fan of The Prisoner, you will find a number of videos examining, dissecting, vivisecting the show, right? And the usual analysis in regards to The Prisoner is as a show that deals fundamentally with individuality and personal freedom. Those are the two concepts that come out often: personal freedom and individuality. And so that's often the case with the show. And although I think those are certainly uh, essential columns that are part of the analytical framework of The Prisoner, my examination of The Prisoner is different in that I look at it from a different perspective. I look at The Prisoner not as this simple, well, actually, simple shouldn't be used in regards to The Prisoner. There's nothing simple about The Prisoner. Um, the Prisoner shouldn't be simply seen as this sort of allegorical, surrealistic spy narrative dealing with individuality and personal freedom. Although you could argue that's a nice little précis or summation of the show. My analysis is more of a professional one in regards to The Prisoner. That is, I look at The Prisoner from a work assessment aspect. I think what's important to look at, and I don't know if anyone's ever done this. I mean, I've seen some of the analysis, before I came on here to discuss the show. I had seen some videos about The Prisoner, and I saw the first episode, Arrival of The Prisoner, again. And I think what's striking to me about The Prisoner is that The Prisoner is a show about, and I think what isn't remarked about The Prisoner is that it is a show about a man who fundamentally has left his career behind. I think that's very important. So I will address it from, I don't know that workplace is quite the right way to address it, but from a career standpoint and a career assessment. Because when you look at that show, you have to look at what questions are demanded and asked of him, right? The question that is continually asked of number six is, why did you resign? So, my conceptualization and my analysis of The Prisoner is that of, I would argue that it is a show about the rejection of the workplace, um, the the walking away from career. That's very important because you have to keep in mind in the credits, as I had mentioned, that's why I cited the credits here and the opening credits. The opening credits of The Prisoner, he takes out an envelope, puts it down on the desk, and of course he bangs the desk, right, of the person who we don't know that he's talking to. We can't even hear what he says because the opening title music is playing. So we can't hear what he's saying. And that's, I think, indicative of the show. Anyone who's seen the show realizes that lack of knowledge is important, right? So when we look at it from a workplace, from a career perspective, from a professional perspective, it becomes a slightly different show. That's the strength, of course, of an outstanding TV series, of an out television show, because and just as it is a movie, right? I used to review movies years ago. I used to go to film festivals and see, I don't know, 40 or 50 movies or something like that. And I don't know how many I reviewed because I used to be a film reviewer. I used to, and and also just a reporter in general, writing features. I was a freelance journalist for over 20 years. But getting back to the film aspect of that, what you understand about a good film is that a really good film is a film that you can discuss continuously and endlessly because it contains within it so many motifs, symbols, archetypes, um, and plot points that require examination and dissection. And I think that, and so that's the quality of a good film because you can spend hours and hours and hours, or a really good film, an excellent film. You can spend hours and hours and hours with your friends discussing it. Whereas the mark of a bad film is that it doesn't take you very long to discuss it. Now, some bad films you could talk about a little for a slightly longer period of time, right? More than a minute, more than 2 minutes, right? Some films if it's a film that's really so bad, yeah, you could talk about it for, I don't know, a few minutes or more. But the difference between a good and a bad film is a good film excites discussion and examination, and a bad film simply requires summation and limitation, right? This was bad because of this, that, and the other thing, and you leave it at that. Maybe there are a couple of things you could point out, but that's the way it is. Now, when we transplant that idea to television, you could argue it's the same thing, even though obviously, if you have a bad TV show, you're going to have more to talk about because there's going to be more material than a film, right? You're going to have several episodes, depending on how long the show lasts or lasted. So with a show like The Prisoner, I think the reason why it survived, why it became not only a cult show, but also why it became a show that has become a fan favorite, that has created a fan base that has lasted for years and years and years, because the show came out in 1967 and lasted until I think 68. I think the reason why that is the same qualities I noted in regards to a good film, good motion picture. But here's where the difference is. A really a television show like The Prisoner that you can talk about endlessly is a show that denies you. That's why you can talk about The Prisoner. What The Prisoner does is it denies you easy understanding. It denies you the ability to simply sum it up. You can if you want to. You can do that for any television show. But The Prisoner is different in that it denies one the opportunity to simply label it. It's a show that's very hard to label. It's difficult to sum up. It is, for some people, probably, who will look at it, who don't become fans of it, probably very frustrating. It probably creates a certain, for anyone who looks at it, a certain amount of emotion, right? It'll create with them a certain amount of the basic aspect. The problem with television has always been that television has to be explicable. It has to be easily understood. And The Prisoner is a show that is the complete and utter opposite of this ideal. It is a show that cannot be entirely understood. It is a show that is not readily available on the lowest common denominator of television. Now, I use that term lowest common denominator. Um, I use that term intentionally because I remember reading a book by a man called Garner McKay, and he was on a show. He was an actor, and he was on a show called I think it was Adventures in Paradise back in the 50s. And I don't know how many episodes he shot, but I think he was shooting it in Hawaii, if I'm not mistaken, or parts of the Pacific. I can't recall. And he noted that television was basically lowest common denominator, and he was right. That is what television has become. But with a show like The Prisoner, it transcends the uh, base and, you know, intellectually diluted and denuded origins of the medium, and it transcends it to become this to, to a higher plane of meaning and a higher plane of understanding, not only understanding but appreciation. Now I'm sounding much like the reviewer and the critic I once was in the way I'm talking, so I understand that. So let me get to my analysis because I guess I'm kind of like The Prisoner in that aspect. Uh, I'm kind of like the show in that aspect. Oh, thank you. Someone in the chat had mentioned thanks for discussing the show. Well, thank you. Um, I don't think I don't know if there are any Prisoner fans out specifically out there aware of this live. So you know, I just went live, so I didn't really prep anyone because again, these are experiments. Um, and for those of you just joining us, if anyone has joined us, this of course is the live show, uh, and we're discussing the 1967 to 1968 television series, The Prisoner, which was not only shown in the UK, also shown to some extent in the US. And later on, it was on some PBS stations, right? That was kind of like Monty Python too. Um, that's where the TV show Monty Python really got a lot of its traction in the states was on PBS. So, The Prisoner was also shown on some PBS stations as well later on. And it was interesting. One PBS station in California had actually had a psychiatrist, an academic, come in to do analyses um, on every episode, I believe, of the Prisoner. They ran the episodes, And they had this psychiatrist from, I don't know what university, but the psychiatrist come in and do like, I guess, a prelude and an epilogue, or prologue and an epilogue to each episode. So that was very interesting to me that they got an academic and a psychiatrist of all people to weigh in on the prisoner. That's why I said it's a very different show. Um, so I think it's only fair, on that note, to discuss my analysis of specific analysis of the prisoner. Now, the prisoner itself is, as I mentioned, a show that is, uh, the prisoner itself, as any fan will be aware of, has its main character, which is only known as number six. We don't know who the name of the character is, but it has its character number six, located in this quaint, charming, I would argue beautiful, kind of seaside village, which is known as the Village. It was actually filmed at a place called Port Meron in Wales. Gorgeous place. I'd love to go there. I'd love to go there. Love to do that. In fact, if I had my dream, I'd love to do an analysis like this live from Port Meron in Wales. I'd love to do that. If anyone's listening, it can make that happen. But I don't think that's going to happen. But yeah, I'd love to do that. In any event, um, number six, I had mentioned what happened in the credits, right? He appears to have resigned and goes back to his flat. There's gas that you know blow that is um, that that shoots in through the door, as the doorknob, and knocks him out. And the next thing he knows, he wakes up in the village. So number six's preoccupation in the series of the prisoner is to escape the village. And so there are all of these, and what happens in the village is their main preoccupation, like the one thing that is consistent because things change all the time. For example, the person he normally has to deal with is known as number two, but he doesn't have, strangely enough, one number two that he deals with. He has multiple number twos because usually, I think, with the exception of actor Leo McKern, who's in a couple of episodes. So number six has to deal with the number two, right? But the number two changes, right? So when we get into my analysis of the idea of the prisoner as an examination of the rejection of professionalism or of the profession and a denial of career, not a denial of work per se, but a denial of career, right? Walking away from his profession, denial of career. So viewing it from that aspect, one of the things I would cite in that regard is the depersonalization of the village. The seeming tranquility, the seeming charm, and it is tranquil and it is a charming place, but the seeming normality of the village is masked by the fact that he is not there of his will. He's there because he's been brought there. How he's been brought there, we don't know. Why he's been brought there, we do not know. But the first thing I would cite in my analysis is the number two character. The number two character is always changing. And I would argue with the constant changing of the number two character is indicative of the constant reshuffling you find in corporations and companies, right? You know, a number of people stay in companies, but for the most part, especially in this economy and in this day and age, people come and go. People have jobs for about a year at best, and then are fired or quit or move on to whatever else they do. And so, with somebody like number two to me is indicative of the sort of what I would call in the context of the prisoner, the corporate state, right? Some people would say, what do I mean by corporate state? In this case, you're dealing with number six is most likely a former spy, right? Former secret agent. It's not really, I don't think it's stated explicitly in the series that he's exactly a secret agent that I can recall. But I believe it's, for the most part, that's the idea that we get in regards to number six, right? So the number two character to me in my analysis of the prisoner as again the rejection of the rejection of career, the denial of career, the rejection of professionalism from a kind of workplace or work type of analysis is the number two is indicative of the changeover and the multiplicity of people that you find in companies and corporations, right? You deal with this person, you deal with that person. Because part of what the prisoner is about is depersonalization, the kind of changes in society where society is no longer about the human being, it's about the artificial, it's about the mechanical, it's about, in this case, because that series was done in the 60s, but what we would now call, I think, the electronic and the digital these days. Um, so that's an important, I think, component to look at in my analysis because he's always dealing with, he being number six, is always dealing with a new number two. Just like in companies, people change over. This person, the number two is in essence a job. It's a slot. It's a position. You could also argue that the prisoner is also, in its own way, and I don't know if people have argued this, a kind of take on the nature of television, right? Because if you look at the number two, it's always usually played or is always played by another actor, much like television shows replace people at times, right? They replace actors. They get rid of certain people, right? Um, Casts change at times. Characters that were there or actors that were there playing a character gone, and a new character and a new actor is there, right? So the very nature, I believe, of um, the very nature of work is reflected in the sort of changeover. And the number two character to me is reflective of what I would call that corporate state, right? Um, as I see it in The Prisoner. That's what I call it, the corporate state. Um, that number two is always changing, it's always different, because that's another challenge for number six to deal with. Um, and this gets to the second aspect that I would argue, which is sort of get to another aspect, or a second aspect, I would argue, of the prisoner, and that is the prisoner as a another aspect. I think is the main question that is asked of number six, which is why did you resign? You hear that there aren't too many consistent elements within the prisoner. It's been argued that the prisoner, consists of a lot of standalone episodes, or every episode is standalone. And I think that's true. But you do have at least one or two consistent threads, right? And one of the threads that you have is the question, why did you resign? Right? They keep asking him, why did you resign? Why were you there? Well, not why were you there, but why did you resign? Why did you leave? And this also gets to the aspect of work and career, right? We know that people quit jobs and some of them quit careers, but you never really, but you won't find yourself marooned on some island with people asking you, why did you resign? Why did you quit? And I would argue this is another aspect of what I would call, again, rejection of professionalism and denial of career. Um, the number six character resigns, he leaves. It's very clear he's not happy and that he has resigned on a matter probably of principle, I would assume, because it's clear he's insistent on getting out of there. Right? When we see the credits in The Prisoner, and when he, after he parks his car and he moves on, the door says, way out. He pushes that door open. Another little, I guess nowadays you would call that a cookie, maybe, or possibly cookie. I don't know if that would be designed as a cookie, but is it cookie or is it Easter egg? I'm sorry, I didn't grow up in the DVD era, so forgive my lack of jargon. I guess Easter egg would be a term for that. But that's an interesting, one of many interesting aspects of that show is when you see him go through the door, it's way out, right? But of course, way out means you're coming out. He's not coming out, he's going in. But of course, he's going in to resign. So he wants a way out of his job. He wants a way out of his career. He wants a way out of his profession, right? But that question, why did you resign? That's one that's wrapped up in the preoccupation with career and work. People leave careers, they leave jobs, and sometimes people find that others find that inexplicable. Why did you go? Why did you leave? Why give up your career? And you hear that in The Prisoner, right? When you hear number two says one of the number twos say, look through his file and say, very good record and so forth. Is this the man that resigns? Is this the man that leaves? Again, that preoccupation with resigning and the means to do so is indicative of career. It's indicative of profession, right? That's an important element because most people look at The Prisoner again from the standpoint of personal freedom, and they look at it from a standpoint of individuality. Not that those aren't in the series, but those aspects I think serve the higher purpose, which is what I would call the denial of work and the rejection of professionalism. The reason why number six can assert his individuality or tries to assert his individuality is because he's resigned. Because he's not an individual as we imagine or we assume a spy, an intelligence agent. He is ultimately, like anybody who works in any company, in this case, works for the state, he's an employee. To use an interesting parlance, he's a company man. You know, for those who are familiar with intelligence agencies, especially in this country, you'll know what I mean by that. But fundamentally, he is, in intelligence parlance, a company man. And when he has decided not to stay in the company, there are repercussions. For the average person, the repercussion is you no longer have an income, and you no longer have a job. But for the prisoner, the repercussions are he's whisked away to some remote place, this village on this island, and he's subjected to constant barrage of questions like, why did you resign? And it's the barrage of that question and numerous other questions and numerous other aspects that gets to a third aspect of my analysis in regards to the prisoner, which is that of um, psychological conditioning, psychological aspects, which is psychological conditioning. Nowadays, I understand for a number of tests, people have to fill out a psychological profile, and some people don't like that, right? They don't like answering all these questions, these intimate questions. Uh, Now, I don't know if people have to, because I was a freelance writer, I was a freelance journalist, so um, I maybe had during my career one staff writer job with a tiny little newspaper in my career outside of freelancing, but that was about it. So I never had to deal with. I was never a corporate guy. I never worked for corporations as an employee, so I was never a company man. Not in the context I'm talking about here, but in general. So I was never that. So from my understanding, I never had to deal with you know company policies and company regulations and all of that corporate stuff. But my understanding is that people sometimes when they apply for jobs, they have to sell out psychological profiles, and it's the psychological aspect of the prisoner that again reminds me of career and work or deals with that because basically what the prisoner, or should I say number six, goes through while he is in the village is us with every episode is a means of he's basically being poked, prodded, looked at, dissected. Not unlike some employees are today with these psychological profiles or seeing a psychiatrist or whatever. They're assessed, they're they're examined, they're analyzed, um, and certain professions require some degree of visiting a therapist or visiting a psychiatrist or something like that. And that's interesting. Again, it's intriguing to me. If you look at that character is being put through the ringer in every episode, in a sense, because he's constantly being um, not just asked, "Why did you resign?" but there are times when he's literally, you know, like the episode, the Western episode of The Prisoner, the episode where it was a Western. Turns out it was something that occurred in his mind, right? But that's because he's in and out, in this facility, having technicians and medical personnel, you know, dealing with him and messing with him, I should say. And that's again another aspect of the prisoner is that sort of psychological prodding, psychological testing. When you look at every episode of the prisoner, it's essential that he's being tested, that he's being pushed. Basically, what they're doing is he's almost like, I don't want to say this. It's almost like those test facilities for maybe not cars but other types of products, where they put products supposedly through. They smash them against walls. They throw things at them or whatever. That's essentially what number six is going through with every episode of The Prisoner. He's being essentially um, poked, prodded. He's being tested. He's being pushed. He's being strained to the limit so that he will possibly crack. But you get the sense in The Prisoner that it's not so. They often that it's not so much about finding out why he resigned, because as you see in the credits, he laid down what appeared to be a resignation letter. We don't know, but we can assume. So we don't know. So why is it important that they ask him whether he resigned or not? I don't think it's a matter of what. I don't think they necessarily want to know. I think they want him to be able to give them the information. they have to, they want him to come to the point of giving the information, as they call it. Because you also hear that phrase called information, right? Um, and so it's constant. But I think fundamentally it's about poking, prodding, pushing him to the limits for its own sake, right? In a sense, I think he is, in a sense, like a guinea pig. He's like the subject of an experiment, in a sense. But I think with what he goes through in every episode, that psychological conditioning, that psychological testing, that psychological really being able to, I think it was this prodding, this poking. Really, it's a way of trying to push him to the extent that they can not so much get what they want from him, but get him to a place where he will simply do what they want. It's not unlike George Orwell in 1984, the novel 1984. You know, the main character in that novel eventually goes from, questioning Big Brother, who's the authority in that sort of dystopic world, to loving or accepting it, and that's done through torture and other means. But he has to get to a point where he accepts Big Brother, right? I believe the character's name is, I recall, Winston Smith, if I'm not mistaken. It's been a while since I read 1984. If I'm mistaken, please, anyone in the chat, please let me know. But that character in 1984 gets to a point where he accepts. He says he loves Big Brother, but what have you. But he's made to accept the reality of the world around him and not question the world around him. Much like the prisoner, that's the intent in regards to number 6 in the prisoner, to get him not to question the world around him and to accept the world around him. But the difference is number 6 never does that. Number 6 never accepts the world around him um, and comes to peace with it. He always rebels against it. So my personal view is the reason he's able to rebel against it, and again assert his individuality and engage and try to find that personal freedom, is because he resigned his job, because he left his career, because he rejected his profession. Otherwise, he can't do that. Someone in the chat has said something about the obsolete man. I've never heard of that. Sorry. But so just as in 1984, the main character was made to accept and uh, accept the world around him, accept the reality of the world around him, and to either embrace it or at least not fight against it. The character of number 6 can never and doesn't ever accept the reality of the world around him, and always is in rebellion against it. Always is. Um, and thus, we get to, I think, um, the final part of the analysis in regards to the prisoner, which is, um, I think, the idea of, which strangely enough is the idea of retirement. This may sound odd considering what I've said about, you know, work and career, right? because the he's rejected his career. He's rejected. They always want to know why did you resign, and then you see him sort of put through the paces to get him to a place where he can accept that. Kind of like I would say psychological profile, in the sense that he's dissected and he's analyzed, and will they do more than that? Uh, I think there's also, kind of strangely enough, the idea of retirement, and so I think that to a great extent is part of what the village represents because he's resigned from his career and resigned from his profession, and so hmm, hmm, I think. So the idea of retirement seems like an odd place to eventually go when it comes to looking at the prisoner. But I think that's a part of, well, certainly a part of my analysis of the show. But I think it's an important part of breaking down and dissecting the prisoner. Um, and the reason I say this is because when you look at the village, and as I mentioned, it's very tranquil, very nice, seacoast. You can view the seacoast because it's a seacoast town. It's that idea of getting away from the mundane, and this is a remote place. We assume it's remote, but it's a sort of very pleasant. The people are friendly. It's a nice environment. Um, it's it's we could see that it's an environment in harmony with because the man whose vision was and the guy who I guess had the village built, the man who was behind the village, was a conservationist, and he wanted to sort of uh, build a sort of environment that would work with nature and in relation to nature and not against it. And so we see this kind of sort of harmonious type of environment in many respects, pleasant environment, um, from as a kind of nice place to get away. It's certainly not like the big city or the big cities that we're aware of. It's not even really like small towns. It's not even like suburbs. It's this kind of remote village. Uh, it's supposedly on an island. It's a seacoast village on this island that is away from not only the major urban centers, but also away from the world of work and career. So it makes sense that the number six character is transported from London and has resigned his post or his position, most likely as a secret agent, or should I say intelligence agent, and winds up being transported to this remote environment, which is nothing but pleasant. See, it's the kind of place that you could go, and people do go there. Tourists go to Port Miron, not just fans of the prisoner, but also tourists in general. They go there to enjoy themselves, have a good time, because it's a kind of wonderful environment. And when you think about retirement, what is retirement? It's getting away from the career, getting away from work, getting away from the pressures of one's profession, if you have a profession, or one's vocation. And so, what's striking about the village in terms of my, in this regard, is he has quit his job and he's in this pleasant environment. But of course, as I mentioned before in my second point, there is the psychological testing, prodding effort to condition him. So it's almost like a carrot and stick approach, right? You place this man in this pleasant seaside, seacoast environment. People seem they're happy and they're well, uh, like they're in good moods, um, as if they're happy with their lots in life, and that's another way for this character to be not so much examined and prodded and poked, but it almost is like giving him. Uh, it's almost a kind of, I would say, carrot and stick approach, right? We know what the stick was, right? The constant questioning, the effects that operant conditioning and psychological conditioning, but also the carrot approach, which is the village itself and the environment, the geographical surroundings, the geography, the surroundings of the um, of the village. So much like retirement is about getting away from career, about getting away from jobs, about getting away from professions, about getting away from the humdrum, stressful, and carefree aspects. You may have stress as a retired person. You may have problems and issues as a retired person, but you don't have the stresses and problems and issues of work because you're not working. You don't have the stresses and problems and issues of professions and vocations because you don't have a profession or vocation anymore. Even if you're a doctor, you'll always be seen as a doctor, and if you're a lawyer, you'll be seen as a lawyer. You're a retired doctor, retired lawyer, right? So, and again, this is part of, some would argue, the genius of the show. I would argue the brilliance of the show is this, placing this character, this man, in this environment while you go to work on him. Because when you think about it, the whole premise of the show is that this man, number six, wants to escape the village. Now, if the village were this rundown, awful, um, industrial, suit filled, you know, garbage strewn place, then it'd be very easy for him to run away. One could understand, hey, who wants to live there? But when you look at how clean, how pleasant, how airy, how lovely, how wonderful the village is, the seaside, seacoast town, the question is, why would you want to escape that? Why would you want to leave that? See, the idea of basing it in a location like that was a stroke, was a real stroke of genius on the part of Patrick McGowan. And we'll give him some credit, maybe even George Markstein himself, but I would give most of the credit to Patrick McGowan, um, because that makes the point for you. You don't have to, because it's a show that does not give you answers. It requires you to look for them. That's what you have to understand about The Prisoner. The show does not give you answers. It requires you to look for them. Right? Television, as I had mentioned before, is a lowest common denominator um, medium, in that it often requires or demands that you are fed what you need. Much like food, you're given what you need, and you eat it, and oh, okay, this is what it is. Um, but the prisoner doesn't do that. The prisoner shows but does not tell. And that's what I learned when I was in college studying literature. the hallmark of literature, as I learned it, or I was told, was show, not tell. Right? You give people descriptions. If you're writing a novel or writing a short story, you give them a character, you give them descriptions, but you don't give them everything, not even everything they need. I'll give you an example. Ernest Hemingway's Hills Like White Elephants, which was one of my favorite short stories that I read when I was in college. That entire short story is nothing but dialogue. There are no descriptive paragraphs that I can recall. You, what you get are one line of dialogue followed by another line of dialogue followed by another line of dialogue, another line of dialogue. And again, it remains one of my favorite short stories because what Hemingway is doing is showing you and certainly not telling you. He's not giving you much. It's elliptical. It's like you're walking by someone and they're having a discussion. You don't know who this is or these people are. You have no idea what their what their lives are like. You don't know them. All you know is what you hear. And it could be a minute that you walk by, or you could be standing in line and you listen to somebody for 5, 10 minutes, or what have you. But all you know is what you hear. And in regards to the prisoner, in a sense, the prisoner is a little like that, not entirely like that. But again, it's about show, not tell. That's one of the best ways that I can describe the prisoner. Show, not tell. It shows us, but it tells us nothing. And as I mentioned before, the answers are not provided for you. You provide the answers. This is why the final episode, Fallout, created supposedly a fallout, at least according to Patrick McGowan, because he said he had to leave the UK because people were infuriated with the ending of The Prisoner. Why? Well, for obvious reasons. What they wanted were easy answers, and they got nothing. They didn't get those. Right? And when you look at this show, and you look at The Prisoner, the hallmark of a great series like that is you can constantly explore its narrative themes, motifs, and symbols. You look at the text and the subtext, and that's the great strength of The Prisoner. And so, in my analysis, what we've explored three areas, right? We've explored the idea of, we've looked at the reality of why, the question of why he resigned as a constant theme relating to rejection of professionalism and denial of career. We looked at operant conditioning, psychological testing, and pushing and prodding of the prisoner and of number six as a way of pushing him to the edge in order to get him to do what they want, but in the end it doesn't because he refuses to give in. He refuses to be pliant and obedient. And the last is the idea of retirement. But it's retirement as a sort of carrot compared to the stick that we saw in the second example, or the second component, or column or pillar, which was the psychological poking and prodding. So those three aspects, right? Why did you resign? Psychological testing and retirement make up my analysis of the rejection of professionalism and the denial of career in my look at the prisoner. So for those of you that stuck around, or those of you that were here for any period of time, I guess no one was, which is fine by me. Again, this is another test live, um, second episode, I guess, of the live show. Again, this has been the live show, and we've been live. Seeing you.